Alrighty, so our recording has begun, and I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker, Henry Michalski. Henry Michalski was born in Kazakhstan and arrived in the United States with his family as a 4-year-old in 1949. The following year, the family settled in San Francisco. Michalski had a long, successful career as a high school history teacher in Napa, California, later becoming involved in local politics and journalism. He is the author of the novel Torn Lilacs, which we will hear about today. His proudest accomplishments are his 2 children and 3 grandchildren. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Henry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Maddie and to Stenelisa Tilcock for having me at the Sutro Library, which is on the campus of San Francisco State University, as you said, my alma mater. So I'm especially proud and honored to be here tonight. Thank you very much for having me. My friends, it's hard to believe that it's 80 years since the revelation of the greatest crime in human history. We call it the Shoah in Hebrew, the Holocaust, the extermination of 3 million Jews in the world. That's about 1 out of every 3 Jews in existence were murdered intentionally by the Nazis. I was at a reunion in Napa last week, and a lady approached me who I knew back in the 50s, and she said, "Henry, haven't we seen this movie already? I thought we were there." Never again. My friends, never again has morphed into yet again. Today, Israel, the indigenous homeland of the Jewish people for more than 3,500 years, they prayed to the same God in the same religion, on the same soil, and yet Israel is fighting for its very existence today, a 7-front war sponsored primarily by Iran. My heart is broken today with the revelation of the hostages that were discovered this last weekend. 6 young, beautiful Israelis murdered, 1 an American. More than 100 hostages are still kept in the squalid conditions of Gaza in the tunnels. God knows who, where. My heart goes out to the families of every Israeli, and especially the families suffering the loss of a loved one to the murderous Hamas. I think Abba Eban, one of the fathers of modern Israel, summed it up best. Let me read to you, please, just a small quote from Abba Eban. "From the darkest depths of man's divided nature, there sprang at the throat of the Jewish people the most violent hatred that had ever convulsed the life and spirit of mankind." He continues, "No other family of the human race has ever been such a constant target for hatred, violence, and defamation. Yet, in a larger historic perspective, the Jewish anguish is a metaphor for the entire human condition." My friends, I'm going to leave it to the politicians, diplomats, generals, historians to figure all this out. What I'd like to share with you today is the story of 2 common, ordinary people who happened to meet at the onset of the Second World War. They fell in love, and yet they were separated by the war. Torn Lilacs is a book that I had to write. It's a story that had to be told. My mother, more than anybody, wanted her story to be told. She designated me the writer, and she says, "Henry, you're going to tell the world this story. They're not going to believe it. You don't need to exaggerate, embellish. Just tell the story as I've told it to you." After many interviews, starting in 1976, video, audio tape, all traveling to Israel, to New York, doing a lot of research, Washington, D.C., we have a book that I'm exceedingly proud of. I wrote it primarily for my kids. I didn't know who would read it. I had no idea it would go viral. I thought my kids would read it, maybe a few friends. And then the reviews started coming in, and I thought maybe they were trying to make me feel good, but they were outstanding. And pretty soon it became required reading at Sonoma State University. I won 4 literary prizes. I was invited to speak at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles at the Museum of Tolerance. The book has taken me to places I never dreamed I would go. I'm exhilarated by the fact that this book is picking up steam. And I believe it's primarily because it's a love story. It's not Auschwitz. I reject the word Holocaust. I can't read those books anymore. I can't watch the movies. They tear my stomach apart. They rip me apart. Yet, Torn Lilacs, if you read some of the comments, it's a beautiful love story, how my parents met right at the onset of the war, how they were separated. I thought maybe my kids would read it and a few friends, but like I say, it's gone viral, primarily because it's the love story and it takes place. It starts in Poland. It moves quickly to Ukraine, a large section in Siberia, where my mother is slave labor. She's a Zek in a gulag in Siberia. And it takes the reader eventually to Kazakhstan in Central Asia, where I was born in 1945, right between the end of the war in Europe and the end of the war in Japan. I was born on August 3rd, 1945. After about 2 years, my parents said, you know, it's time to go back to Poland. It's time to reestablish our life, to find our families, to get married, to live, to live a normal life. It was a long trek back to Europe, as you can imagine. Like in the old black and white videos, my father tied me to his front. He put my brother Jerry, Joina, named after my grandfather, who I never met, put him on the back, carried everything we owned in his arms. My mother was too weak to travel. At that point, she contracted a tapeworm, of all things. They walked, they took trains, it took months. They finally got back to Szczecin, now part of Poland, where the revelation of the Holocaust was revealed to them. And they discovered, in various ways, the fact that their own families entirely perished. My father had 2 brothers, 2 sisters. He was one of 5 children. He's the only one that survived. My mother was the only one with her brother who survived, but she lost her parents and her beautiful little 13-year-old sister, Mashka, for whom she cried every day. She never forgot Mashka. It's, you can imagine the pain. I can't even imagine what they went through, having lost parents and brothers, and a whole society was uprooted. When I started writing the book, the title Torn Lilacs somehow came to me. I don't know how, like in a dream maybe. And at first, I wasn't comfortable with that. Torn lilacs is like a juxtaposition. A torn is an aggressive motion. Lilacs are beautiful, fragrant flowers. And the metaphor, I suppose, is my parents were torn lilacs. They were torn, they were uprooted, dispossessed from their home, from their family, from their country, and thrown to the wind like delicate petals of a flower. And the name stuck, and I like the name Torn Lilacs very much. Well, you can imagine the depression, how they felt. They ended up in what we call a DP camp, a displaced persons camp in southern Germany, Bavaria, near Traunstein. I discovered later, after the book was published, that our camp was for Jews only, because Jews could not live with non-Jews after the war because they were supposed to be dead. And the Gentiles thought these living Jews are coming back to repossess their homes and take back all their property. And they were killing Jews after the war. So they separated us in a camp just for Jews. And my parents dreamed of going either to Israel. They knew there would be a war. The Arabs would not accept a Jewish country in their midst, something they considered their own. My parents had some kind of distant relatives in New York, and that was an option. Possibly, they went to the consulate every day and very often in Munich. Finally, one day, I'm about 4 years old now. For 2 years, we were in that DP camp. Nobody wanted us. Nobody wanted Jews. France, England, nobody would take a Jew. Finally, in 1949, the United States Congress authorized the Immigration Settlement Act, which allowed 250,000 refugees permanent settlement in the United States, and we were one of the lucky families chosen. My father came home from work one day with a big smile on his face, which was not typical. He was morose and sad and depressed. I understand now why. But he came home with a big smile on his face and he was waving a document around. I had no idea what it was. And he said in Yiddish, Morgen et Megayin of a große Schiffs Amerika. America had a certain resonance to it. It was like a wonderful place. And Jerry, my older brother, was jumping up and down happy. I figured I should jump up and down and be happy too. It sounded like we're going to Disneyland, a very happy place. My mother instilled in us and told us how privileged we are, how incredibly lucky and fortunate we are to be allowed into this extraordinary country where you can actualize all your God given talents and dreams, where you're not judged by your religion and held back handicapped by that. But anything you set your mind to through education, that was the vehicle for progress and moving ahead. Through education, you can do anything in America. What a great country. Well, sure enough, the next day we went up to Bremenhaven, up to the port, northern Germany. It was an American destroyer. It was called the General Muir. Jerry and I bent over and we looked at the very end. We couldn't see the end of the ship. It was the biggest structure I've ever seen in my life. And I figured, well, the United States is probably just on the other side of that boat. It's got to be. It can't be much longer. Well, for the next 2 weeks, we're on that boat. And that's where the love of America was really instilled in me. My mother programmed it, and she said, Henry, how fortunate. We're going to be good citizens. We're going to pay taxes. We're going to build and create and make something beautiful. And nobody can ever kick us out of here again. This is going to be our permanent new country. Aren't we lucky? And I couldn't wait to get there. Sure enough, one glorious foggy morning, there was a lot of excitement on the boat. Everyone was coming to the front, and they were all pointing at a statue in New York Harbor, and tears were flowing, and people were crying, and very emotional scene. Jerry was jumping up and down, saying, "Look at all those cars! One of those cars is our uncle." Well, we didn't just get into New York, you had to go through Ellis Island in those days. We heard that a woman had contracted tuberculosis on the ship and she would not be allowed to settle in the United States. What a shanda, what a horror. My mother held on to me and Jerry tight and prayed to God that we would pass all the tests. They looked in our eyes and they checked our gums. Everything was good. Time to go to New York. I would not get on the ferry to Manhattan. And my father said, "You got to go. We can't leave you here. We're just going over there. See all those big buildings, those skyscrapers? That's where we're going, just across there." I said, "Nope. I did not want to see another boat, ship, as long as I lived." And I ground my feet into the ground. And I was actually dragged into the United States, believe it or not. Well, we lived in New York for a while. It was very difficult. We lived in Brooklyn in a 4-story cold water tenement flat. Jerry and I were given a bath in the kitchen sink. For a view, we had a chimney with smoke, and the streets were broken glass. It was not right. My father was on the subway for hours every day trying to find work. He had no language. He was on the metric system. He couldn't get a job. Finally, he got a job, $30 a week. He was paid under the table. My mother, who organized everything, she was the great Führer in the family. And she said, we survived the Nazis, we survived Siberia, we survived Kazakhstan, Europe, New York, terrible here, cold in the winter, hot in the summer. Let's go to California. It never rains in California. My father had a distant cousin there that sponsored us. Sure enough, we took a train out to San Francisco. 1950, it was the bicentennial. It was the centennial for the state of California. Big parades, happy. I was put into a kindergarten class, and English came to me very quickly. I loved assimilating into the American culture, but at home it was another club where all the Jewish immigrants met. Grain Bakery, there was a synagogue there. It was where we congregated. And many of their friends would come to the house on the Sabbath and they would talk into the night. And I was a little boy, I'm 5, 6 years old, and I'm hearing stories. I see tattoos on their forearms, numbers. I hear stories, horrible stories of amputations and killings and running and savagery, just things that a child should not know. But as I grew up, got older, my mother told me stories. I would watch her dress, for example, and she showed me the 15 holes in her leg. She always referred to them as my 15 holes, where the gangrene was. And I heard bits and pieces of amputations and running in the snow and Nazis. I had no idea. When I started to teach in 1968 in Napa, California, I was hired primarily because of my background, I think. I had something to tell. When I first started to teach and we got around to the Second World War in our US history class, I would tell the story of the 6 million Jews who perished. And I noticed the eyes of my students were kind of vacant, non-committal. There was no emotion. And I wondered what's going on. And I recall a statement from Joseph Stalin, who one time said, "One death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic." So rather than giving numbers and names of generals and battles, I decided to tell this story of two ordinary people, common people, not generals, not presidents, two common people who met just at the onset of the war and what they went through. And I'm telling you, my friends, this was the best day of the school year. They were absolutely stunned. They were quiet. Nobody moved. When the bell rang, nobody moved. They quietly came up to the desk. Many of the kids were crying. "Mr. Michalski, you have to write this book. It sounds like a movie." This is what everyone says. It sounds like a movie. Well, it took me a long time. I started in 1976. I sat my parents down and I did many writings of the book. I wanted it to be excellent. When I read to my mother, like I said before, she said, "Don't embellish, don't exaggerate, just tell the story because it's an amazing story and the world has to know exactly what happened to us. So it doesn't happen to anybody else. It could be an abject lesson for people. Just tell the story." So where do you start a story like this? The original version had my mom as a little girl polishing the candlesticks. And I said, "No, let's grab the reader right away. Let's get right to the story." So, page one, you are introduced to the two characters. Page one, my mother is standing on a table. She's singing and she's dancing in a Zionist nightclub. She's trying to bring joy to the hearts of the young kids there because war was imminent. War was coming to Poland. The Nazis were coming. People were terrified. And she wanted to bring happiness to them. She was singing and dancing on the table. Who walks into that club that night? My father. He's in his Polish uniform. He was in the cavalry. He was home on leave. He was with a friend, 6 feet tall, 2 meters, dark hair, beautiful looking, heads turned in amazement. My father took one look at the dark, complected, black eyed beauty dancing on the table, and he fell madly, instantly in love. He said to himself, "I'm going to marry that woman. That woman on the table, that beautiful young girl, she's going to be my wife." Well, when I interviewed my mom, she had a whole different idea about this. She said, "Yeah, he was very persistent. He never missed an opportunity to come. He never came empty-handed. He always bought big bushes of lilacs." The picture on the cover behind me here, one of the only pictures surviving from the village of Gustanin, They both grew up and were raised in this town, but he was 5 years older, so they really didn't know each other. But they were dating, and you could see the lilacs. My friend Bob, who did the cover for me, colorized the lilacs. And he was indispensable and very resourceful. When the war broke out, he was called to the front immediately, fought in a big battle, and was left for dead. Chesek Drinkovsky, a local, fought with him, went AWOL, abandoned the army, came home, and told my mother that Yuska, my father, was hit in the head by a bullet and fell to the ground and died. He died instantly. Chesek said he buried himself. He died a hero for Poland. You can imagine the screaming, the shiva for 7 days. It was terrible. Soon the Nazis entered Gustanin, this little town, and they were making up rules as they went along. Things were getting horrible for the Jewish population. They had to wear yellow stars identifying them as Jews, which limited their ability to even go out shopping. They had to obey the curfew. The penalty was death, of course. Everything was death. Times were horrible. Signs went up all over Gustanin. All men ages 15 to 50 report to the train station in 3 days. You're going to concentration camps for your own protection. The Nazis said for your protection because the Poles are virulent anti-Semites. It's like they're kielbasa. They love kielbasa, but they never inquire as to its contents or how it's made. But they love their anti-Semitism. They know nothing about Jews, but it's part of their genetic makeup. So the Germans were going to protect the Jews by sending them to the camps. My mother at this time had a cousin in a nearby village who had a brain tumor. They thought it was because she didn't wear a head covering in the rain, which of course does not cause a head tumor. But her little village didn't have a hospital or a clinic. So her father, the farmer, came in a wagon and brought her to Gustanin, where she had an operation, and it took months for her to recover. At this time, the father came with his wagon, the farmer from his village, to pick up his daughter. A letter arrives. It's January. It's snowing outside. It's a blizzard. The mailman knocks on the door and says, I have a special letter here. It's from Ukraine, from a POW camp. My father is alive. Wow, the perfect storm. They're taking everybody to the camps. My mother's cousin is healing. He's ready to go. Yoska's alive. He's in Ukraine. He's a prisoner of war by the Russians. He's held in a castle in a place called Olesko. That night, a meeting is held in my mother's house, my parents' house. A meeting is held where her father says, tomorrow morning, you're going to go in the wagon with the farmer and you're going to try to get out of town and you're going to go east towards Russia, towards Ukraine, try to find Yuska in that village. He's very resourceful. He will take care of you. He can save you. Here in Gustanin, there's no future for you. There's nothing for you here. We're all going to perish. Please go. Well, you can imagine the feeling. Here it is. It's January the 10th, 1940. There's a blizzard outside, snowing, terribly cold. The Germans are at the checkpoint. If they catch them, if they find them, they'll kill them instantly, trying to escape. But they had no choice. In the morning, you can imagine the scene. My grandfather, who I never met, blesses his daughter and his son, gives him Aaron's benediction, and says, "You're with those." And it's really an amazing scene. They go out to the wagon. They get into the wagon. The farmer puts a tarp over them, and over the tarp, he throws hay that he had for the horses. The girl is sitting on in the wagon in the front with her father. The blizzard is horrible. It's horizontal rain. And they leave. They say their goodbyes. My mother's mother and little Mashka go as far as they can down the road, waving, crying. And of course, they never see each other ever again. Fortunately for the weather, the Nazis were too cold, I guess, to ask any questions or to inspect the wagon. They just barked out some questions. The farmer responded, and they said, "You can go." My mother and her brother are holding each other under the hay, and their hearts are beating. And Kuba says to my mother, "And this is just the beginning. My God, we've got 400 kilometers to go just to get to Yuska. And we can't show our face. We can't walk down the street with our rucksacks. We're obviously runaways. We're Jews. And the peasants here won't help a Jew. For a bottle of vodka, they'll turn in a whole family. If you harbor a Jew, it's death to you and your entire family." They're on their own. They couldn't even ask questions, directions in their own country. They took back roads. They got off and on trains. They hitchhiked with farmers, whatever it was. For the next couple months, they experienced the most harrowing things you can imagine. And I won't go into detail here. This is where you really have to read the book. It's really, truly a miracle. My mom actually thought the book should be called Destiny or Fate, because so many times, at least 6 times, they were caught by the Nazis. And one thing or another saved their life. Somebody intervened, or she spoke gypsy, or she made up a story that they believed somehow, or they escaped. Like the time they jumped over a snowy embankment when they were being marched into the forest with the intention of being murdered and buried in the forest. In the last minute, Kuba and Fela jumped over the embankment and ran for their lives. And then came the dog. And how they escaped the scent of the dog, unbelievable. Fortunately for the snow, the dog was within meters. That would have been the end of them right there. But they held on to each other. Kuba said the Shema. He whispered the last words a Jew says before he dies. But for some reason, the dog missed his mark and went on. And now they were stuck together in the snow. It was dark. They were freezing. They were starving. They didn't know where they were. Kuba says to Fela, "You know, through all these clothes, I could feel your heart beating. Your heart through all these clothes. Can you feel my heart?" And she hugs him very tightly and says, "Yeah, I can feel your heart too. Look how close we came." In the Torah, it's written that even a small thing can save the world. One small thing. Horrendous things happen to them, but finally they get to Olesko. It's a little town in western Ukraine. My father is a prisoner of war held by the Russians in Jan Sobieski's castle. Sobieski was a king of Poland, 16th century, and his castle was up on the hill. The Russians had converted it into into a POW camp. My father's job was to take the old mare, the old horse, down to the city square, and pump water into a 500-gallon wooden tank that he had, and to go up the hill to provide water for the camp, for their drinking water, washing, for whatever, cooking, whatever they needed. And he would make 3-4 trips a day, back and forth and back and forth. And he wrote a letter, and somehow the letter got through. So they had the destination. They meet in this town. It doesn't take long. The Russian authorities find that Kuba and Fela are what they call bijanets. They're foreigners, aliens. They're without papers. They're grabbed and taken with other bijanets to Siberia. They are now zeks, slave labor, fodder for the meat grinder. Nobody gets out of Siberia alive. They literally work people to death. Stalin puts up quotas, and every day you've got to meet the quota. And the rule that Stalin dictated, of course, was he who works, eats. You don't work, you don't eat. And many people just perished. They just couldn't put up with the work and the quotas and the bare existence. Kuba spoke out early on. There was a meeting, and he spoke out and he said to the authorities, if you want us to work and fill quotas, why are you killing us? You're not feeding us anything. And they carefully said, oh, good, tell us more. And they took notes, tell us more. And the men spoke up and they complained. That night, 3 in the morning, knock on the door. They come into the room. They take Kuba out of his bed, along with other people that complained. And they send them off to a big prison in deep Siberia for political prisoners, where they just wasted away their lives. They just smoked themselves and drank themselves to death. They didn't even work. Kuba was taken away, and all the guards said to my mother, forget about him. He's dead. You're never going to see him again. All the girls that my mother worked with in her brigade said to my mother, stop talking about him. He's not coming back. My mother said, no, he's coming back to me. We're going to live, we're going to work, we're going to go back to Poland, we're going to reestablish our life. They said, Fela, you're out of your mind. You're never going to see your brother again. Just get it out of your mind. Well, I'm going to leave out many parts because I would like you to read the book. But eventually, Hitler invades Russia, Operation Barbarossa. 1941, he invades Russia. It's the biggest war in history, Stalingrad. And slowly, the winds of war, the tides of war change. The Russians are capturing tens of thousands of Nazi prisoners. The commandant of my mother's camp, way up in Siberia, has a meeting of all the civilians and says, you're all free now. We need this camp for the German prisoners. They're going to be here soon. You're civilians. We don't need you anymore. You're free to go. But we're not going to give you transportation. No trains, no buses, nothing. You're on your own. We actually hope you stay. The Russians lost 25 million people fighting in what they call the Great Patriotic War. And Stalin desperately wanted to repopulate the country, and he offered any woman who has a baby rice and milk and flour and so much eggs, whatever. But my parents had enough of collectivism, workers' paradise, socialism. They had enough of all that. They dreamed of going back to Poland. And so my mother held a meeting in the camp, and she called all the civilians together, and she said, we're leaving. We're going to get out of this godforsaken place. And they said, yeah, how are you going to go? She said, well, we're going to make rafts. That was her job in the camp. One brigade of girls up on the hill would chop the trees and send them down to the river. My mother worked on the water, lashing the logs together, creating large rafts, which were then sent down the river to the mill to be harvested into timber or lumber. So she knew how to make rafts. She said, let's make some rafts or a raft, and we'll go down the rivers. The rivers in Siberia all run north, south, and we'll go south, south, south to where it's warm. We don't want to be here anymore. It's terrible here. Well, most of the people, as you can imagine, thought my mom was crazy. You're going to go on a raft? You don't have GPS? You don't have maps? You don't know where you're going? You have no idea? She said, don't worry. The rivers go south. We'll end up somewhere nice. Come. Well, most of them thought she was out of her mind, but about 40 people said, yes, we're going to sign up. Jews and Polish, didn't matter. Okay. Well, they ended up making 2 large rafts. The night before they left, she sent some of the men into the commissary to steal food, blankets, tarps, whatever they could find. And for the next 2 weeks, imagine the scene. They were going down the wild rivers of Siberia. A number of people died. My mom told me they would just blow up and they would look like 500-pound people. And their eyes were just like little glistening marbles, like little black shiny marbles. And they were just thrown overboard. The fortunate ones were buried at night when the rafts were tied up. If they saw some lights in the distance, they would park the raft, and some of the men would go into the village, wherever the farms, and they would steal chickens, garlic, whatever they could. My mother stayed behind. She was deathly afraid of dogs. We had a dog story. But somehow they made it. And they went as far as Kazakhstan, where, meanwhile, back in Olesko in Ukraine, my father is also released from the Russian POW camp. General Anders, a Polish general, had started Polish Corps II, Polish POWs, which he took to the British front to fight with the Brits against the Nazis. Great Britain, as you know, was the last holdout. The Nazis had every country in Europe practically, with the exception of Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, and Great Britain. But to go, my father had to lie and tell him that he was Polish, Christian. And his friend said, lie to them. His friends in camp, lie. Don't tell them you're Jewish. Lie, and you can go to Britain. You'll get a uniform. You'll eat. You'll fight Nazis. You'll survive. Come with us. And my father thought that was kind of strange. He said, what, you mean I have to lie about my religion to fight for my own country, which treats me as a second-class citizen? And it wants nothing to do with me? You're out of your mind. I'm going to go, I know where Fela is, and I'm going to go up to Siberia to find her. His friend said, you're going to go to Siberia? You don't know where she is. Siberia is the size of 20 Polands. My father says, don't worry, I'll find her. And if you knew my father, that's the kind of person he was. He always said, don't worry, I'll find her. So he's up in Siberia, and I'm going to leave it there. I don't want to give away too much, but he's way up in Siberia looking for her. She's already in Kazakhstan. And she gets very sick. There's a huge population down there. The war, people are coming from all over. Disease breaks out. There's no place to live. People are renting space on the floor by how much room you take up. It was just a terrible situation, but somehow he does find her, of course. Here I am. And this might be a good place to, I don't have a clock here, but it might be a good place to take some questions, and we can elaborate some more if you like. But I think I'll stop at this point. Anybody out there?
Alrighty, thank you so much, Henry, for your talk. This was very insightful and engaging. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording now, and then we can take some questions.